Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many people wanting to know if ethical banking works. Welcome to you all. My name is Annika Kerol, and I've been working for Réseau Financité for 10 years now. Financité is a Belgian NGO that promotes solidarity-based and responsible finance since 30 years. I'm delighted that NewB and Finance Watch asked me to moderate this panel of ethical banking experts. They are not here there, but they are not far. Thank you also to the Académie Royale des Sciences, des Lettres et des Beaux-Arts Open Policy. This debate can take place in this beautiful building, neoclassical building. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Apache, which is the firm that live streamed this event tonight and allows anyone that pre-registered to follow the exchanges. Finally, I'd like also to let you know that Passaporta will be outside of this room when the talk is finished with different books in Dutch, French and English on the topic. So, this evening's talk is titled The Future of Ethical Banking. It wishes to examine what alternatives exist to current mainstream commercial banks and how more ethics can be integrated into mainstream commercial banks. So just to give you a bit an idea of the evening, we will in a few moments hear the internationally renowned speaker Christian Felber for about 20 minutes. Born in Salzburg, Austria, Christian Felber initiated the economy for the common good. This new economic model deconstructs the quest for profit and competition. It wishes to reshape economic relations on common good and cooperation. Beyond Utopia, this avant-garde model has already been adopted in hundreds of companies across Austria and Germany. Here, Christian Felber will touch on it, but will concentrate on ethical banking. Christian Felber is also a contemporary dancer, a lecturer, and an author of many bestsellers, some of which you can probably find tonight. Then we will have our panel experts, which I will present in more details later. Tom Ollinger from the ethical banking sector, Professor Luc van Liedekerke from the academic world, and Benoît Lallemand from a European advocacy organization will exchange views on various questions linked to ethical banking from 6:30 to 7:30. From 7:30 to 8, we will be glad to take a few questions from the public to our panel experts. These questions can be asked in your own language, as long as it's Dutch, French, English, or maybe Spanish, as Christian speaks Spanish very well as well. Finally, after effort comes comfort. We are all invited to a drink and informal exchanges in the room upstairs. So, with no further ado, I give the floor to Christian Felber.
Thanks so much. Voilà. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me for this discussion on ethical banking, maybe within a wider framework and world of ideas, but at least we start with a focus on ethical banking. If you're interested in getting to know the economy for the common good, which is my major project at the moment, let's say it's 100 times bigger than the project Bank for the Common Good in Austria, you have an opportunity to go to Ghent tomorrow in the evening. I think it's at 8 p.m. and I will present in an ordinary evening lecture the economy for the common good. And my second preliminary remark, while the technique is being established, merci beaucoup, is my relationship to Finance Watch. I'm not 100% sure if this is true, what I'm going to tell you now. But I was engaging for a movement for a different globalization, not against globalization, for a different globalization, which is called ATTAC, Association pour la taxation des transactions financières pour l'aide aux citoyens. I was the founder in Austria, and one of the German founders was Sven Giegold, who is now a member of the European Parliament here. And Sven Giegold and Austrian ATTAC chapter, we founded on the one hand the global tax justice movement. So if you might heard about the financial shadow index, that is one of the concrete tools of the global tax justice movement that arose out of the international ATTAC movements, which on the other hand founded the World Social Forum, and the World Social Forum is an alternative event to the World Economic Forum, which started in Brazil in its first editions. And Sven, when he became a member of the European Parliament and in the committee, an Economic and Financial Monetary Committee, and started to work on legislations in order to regulate the excessive financial system, then his vis-a-vis was on a daily basis between 50 and 100 lobbyists from the financial industry. And I say that can't be the whole story. We need a professional partner who is advocating the common good. And as far as I know, that was the reason why Financial Watch came into existence, but maybe we will. But I think it's an interesting story. Huh? He wants to create directives and other legislative instruments for the common good, and he doesn't have a vis-a-vis in the European Parliament. That's an interesting fact. And I, on my side, I developed for more than 10 years ATTAC in Austria. It's now an association in a comparatively small country with 6,000 paying members and more than 25,000 followers on its newsletter. But I faded out 7 years ago because two concrete projects arose and emerged out of ATTAC Austria. One is the economy for the common good, and the other one is the project bank for the common good, which is today a cooperative in Austria with, again, 6,000 cooperativists. We have started to provide our first financial services based on a crowdfunding platform and based on a common good exam. And the months to come will be absolutely decisive for our project, but maybe I go deeper into that later. Just this has been the pathway of my colleague Sven Giegold, and my pathway has been a different one. But still, last preliminary remark, if the question if ethical banks are viable, are possible, depends at least on two factors. One, of course, is the mental infrastructure and our ideas and values, and thus preferences as consumers or investors, as economic citizens, and maybe to an even higher degree, I think it depends on the legal infrastructure and on the legal framework of the economy. As long as banks too big to fail are legal, as long as our tax havens are legal, as long as high-frequency trade and shadow banks and vulture funds and all these phenomena are legal, we will have a very hard life. And there is already a global alliance for banking on values. It exists because there are some of us who are very smart and who are willing to pay a bit more for more ethical products. And maybe we are becoming more, but we're becoming from 0.1% to 1%, or becoming from 1% to 2%. But if you want to become more than 50% or 90%, I think for that it's essential that also the legal infrastructure and the legal framework changes. This is a short list of a much longer list of phenomena that if people had the choice in any democratic country, do you want these phenomena to be legal? I can't imagine that in a single country a majority of the citizens would say, yes, of course, we should have vulture funds because that's part of economic liberty. Yes, of course, we should have high-frequency trade because that's part of economic liberty. I can't imagine. And I will tell you later, we have done first empiric research that people would not allow any of these much longer list of phenomenon which we are having to deal with on a daily basis. Because although there is the European Parliament, and Sven is participating, I think, in 37 regulatory endeavors, none of these phenomena have disappeared. Maybe they have weakened, maybe they have improved, maybe they have become smaller or less harmful, but as far as I know, none of them has disappeared. And there are two big explanations. One is the power relations within a democracy, which by political scientists, I'm also a political scientist, is called post-democracy, by Colin Crouch. You might have heard it. Formally, all elements of constituting elements of a democracy are there. We vote for political parties, they form governments and parliaments, and there are constitutional courts in some countries that watch over the constitutions, and there's a federal president who has a veto in order to prevent the biggest harm by parliaments or governments. But the essence of democracy, that the people's will is implemented or materialized in laws and other legislative acts, is weakened. And in more and more cases, parliaments and governments decide something different, and in more and more cases, the exact opposite of what people would decide if they had the choice. If people had the choice, I don't know if they would, but I guess they would tendentially, instead of voting for these free markets, supported, by the way, by neoclassical economic science, which says that markets function the best the least they are regulated. That's called the efficient market hypothesis, and it already starts with an illusion. It starts with the illusion that markets are something else than the state, are different from the state, and that there is the choice that the state regulates market or doesn't regulate markets. And then if they are not regulated, they are free markets. And already this is an illusion, because if you look a bit closer at markets, what are markets actually? And all of the fundamental elements of markets are state decisions and elements. A protection of private property. Who does it? The state. Private law, contracts, a credit contract protected by the state, the license for the bank given by a state authority, money issued at least partly by the state, and then come all the other regulations, again from the state. So what should be a free market? A free market that deserves that name is out of the state of law, is in the jungle. So if somebody talks to you about the free market, please ask this person to show you where, in which country exists a free market. That person won't be able to give you an example. Okay, but still, there is the efficient market hypothesis. There's a Nobel Prize for economics for efficient market hypothesis for Eugene Fama, although the Nobel Prize for economics does not exist either. Did you know that? There's a Nobel Memorial Prize, which is called like that against the will of the heirs of Alfred Nobel, who are still today publishing in Swedish newspapers, please don't use the name of our grandfather, because he did not give a Nobel Prize to economics, and he would have never given, because he gave the Nobel Prize exclusively to natural sciences, but explicitly and consciously not to social sciences. And economics is a social sciences. We are not talking about natural phenomenon, we're talking about social phenomenon, socially constructed, ideally democratically decided designs of markets. And even though the Swedish Riksbank used and abused, we have to say they abused the name of Alfred Nobel for the Nobel Memorial Prize for economics. If you want a different paradigm, it's hard to get the support from mainstream economics. That's why I made this little excursion. So if you want a different design for the financial and monetary system, and if you want ethical banks, maybe we should rely more on the support of citizens than on mainstream economists. Of course, there are more and more heterodox economists who do not share the neoclassical mainstream, but we need at least the support and the participation of citizens. And this is a modest proposal of a different paradigm than the paradigm of free markets who regulate themselves. The proposal is that we could consider money as a public good. What could that mean? Three things. First, the rules are made democratically because parliaments and governments they deal with these problems and they regulate the financial markets and they regulate the banking sector with a big number of regulations, but they don't eliminate the problems with these regulations. Second, money is a means. It's not a goal for which we strive in economy, it's a means. And the goal for which we could strive in economy could be the common good. This might be an inversion of goal and means. And I'm following Aristotle with this. Aristotle, 2,300 years ago, he made us the favor to distinguish between two different ways to understand and to practice the economy. And one way to practice the economy, he called oikonomia. He was the second Greek philosopher who used the term oikonomia in his writings. And he said in a true oikonomia, oikos the house, nomos, the moral rules thanks to which we organize and we manage the house in order to achieve the goal of the oikonomia. The goal is the well-being of all household members, the common good. And money is just a means to achieve the goal, the common good. And if this relation is inverted, if money making becomes the goal, the purpose of our economic activity, then this by definition is not economy anymore, but it's opposition, which he called krematistike. Krematistike in ancient Greek, the art of making money and get rich. Today we call it capitalism, because yeah, I'm a linguist too. Watch out, be aware of all isms, because that what is in front of the ism is the highest value in this system, and in capitalism, capital is the highest value, a more important value than everything else, from human dignity to a stable global climate, and the increase of capital is the highest goal. And Aristotle said this is not an economy by definition, this is its opposition, it's capitalism. But capitalism is perverted. That's what Aristotle said. I don't say it's perverted, I say it's inverted. Maybe the microphone is falling out now. This is krematistike, or capitalism. It works. That's not a question of it works or if it doesn't work. Maybe it doesn't work for everybody. And this is oikonomia, which works, I hope, for more people and for a longer time. And the new paradigm is actually based on a literal ancient Greek economy, different from capitalism or krematistike. And as long as parliaments and governments are not willing to redesign and organize a transition from a crematistic and capitalistic financial and monetary system to an economic financial and monetary system, I think we need to engage ourselves. Who are we? We, the sovereign citizens of democratic countries. Is Belgium a democratic country? Austria is a democratic country, but the sovereign consciousness among Austrian citizens is quite weak still. So I think we have to work the next 10 to 20 years on the sovereign consciousness of Austrian citizens until they have seen that in the first municipalities, communities, cities, regions have taken place sovereign assemblies with the explicit goal to rewrite constitutional texts, to tame the financial markets and the financial system of today. Oh my God, what is that kind of letter? I'm shocked because that's not my letter. I'm a bit shocked because I don't know what happened. I'm using Arial. Let's pass it quickly over. because it gives me a very strange association with, oh my God, what happened there? It's, okay. If we take the term of sovereignty literally, and again, I'm talking as a political scientist. I studied political sciences, and I was taught that the principle of sovereignty is one of the core principles of democracy. And it has nothing to do with nationality or the nation. It has a completely different meaning, but nobody told me the meaning. The literal meaning of sovereign is to stand above all. Just to stand above all. That's all. It's the whole meaning. It already existed in a monarchy. In a monarchy, who is the highest instance? And in democracy, who is the highest instance in a democracy? The citizens, yes. Somehow we intuitively we know it or we dream of it, but have you ever felt this? Have you ever felt this in your body, in your cells? What would be the consequence if the citizens in a democratic country were the highest instance? Well, everybody else would be below. And we could write the constitution, change it, give power to the parliament, give power to the government, decide an international law, just for instance, CETA or TTIP, or a single law on money issuance, just for instance, or on the size of banks, just for instance. And we have developed a concrete procedure how the monetary part of the constitutions, and later on in the European Treaty and in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, could be reformed directly by the citizens. Assemblies from the local level to the regional level to the national level to the European level. And these assemblies would take between half a year and a whole year. And in the end, we have answers on 10 questions. Which questions? The most fundamental, the most relevant questions. And one of the results will be that only ethical banks will be viable. Only ethical banks will exist, will be competitive, will have a life. And banks too big to fail would not exist. Shadow banks would not exist. Investment banks that make a lot of odd things could not do these things. And maybe we would not have at all banks that are profit-oriented. Why do I dare to say this? Because I wrote a book on money, The New Rules of the Game, and a student from a university made her small thesis out of it, and she asked 150 European citizens. That's not a very large number, but it's a first number, and it was representative, and the result was that citizens would design fundamentally differently each and every of these cornerstones of the monetary and financial system than have today designed and decided our parliaments and governments. And I think that this is a very important message and fact that probably citizens would create a different financial and monetary system. And now I'm going to the core of my of what I was asked to talk about, which are more ethical banks. And I think to start this issue is first creating a fairer competitive environment, which means that the same rules should apply for all players. As long as there exist banks that are too big to fail, the same rules do not apply to all players, because some are more equal than others. And that's why my first question would be, shall we allow banks to be too big to fail, in the meaning that it is not excluded that taxpayers' money is used to either rescue them or support them? The European directive would have to exclude, would have to forbid, to prohibit that taxpayers' money is used for the rescue of banks. That's not the case. The directive of the European Union says that, well, we have to engage shareholders or owners more than we did in the past, and we have to engage creditors more than we have in the past. But, well, then, if that's not sufficient in the last instance, we might also include taxpayers. And in the first case, it was the case in Italy with Monte Paschi. So another example of an extremely flawed, and what was said in 2009? In 2009 was said, never again, we should use taxpayers' money to rescue banks that are too big to fail. If you're serious, we have to eliminate the problem of too big to fail. We have to eliminate banks that are too big to fail and make all banks small enough to fail, with the guarantee that every, at least private bank, can go to insolvency in any moment without bearing a risk for the financial stability. Before that happened, I proposed intuitively, well, I would not regulate by the European Banking Union banks that have actives more than $30 billion, or euros in this case. I would prohibit them. That's my modest proposal. Is it an exotic proposal? Today I'm sure it would meet the majority, the majoritarian support of the citizens. It's, so I would give between 10 and 20 years the banks that have a larger balance sheet to reduce it step by step. Give them 10 years, give them 20 years, but don't allow them to be bigger than 30 billion, or we will see maybe the threshold will be 50 billion, and I'm still fine with it, but it shall not be unlimited. That's the point. And then, can we define ethical banking? And I have 3 more minutes. Of course, I could now describe our project, but I'm a luckier person since the end of 2016, because for the first time, as far as I know, in history of states of law, a national law gives us a definition of what is an ethical bank. That's extremely important, because only if we have a legal definition of what an ethical bank is, we can then support these ethical banks and treat them differently than other banks, that profit-oriented banks. It's the Italian budget law from end of 2016, and the criteria are not exactly the same, but more or less the same. And that's no coincidence, but it's a joyful fact. Common good orientation, I make a tiny jump to the common good balance sheet, and there are already first banks that do their common good balance sheet. No distribution of profits to the owners, because banking is not a business like others, it's a public service, although provided by private banks. No problem with private banks. But money is a delicate issue, and it should not be treated in the same way as other services. Financial services are special services, and the providers of financial services should not profit-oriented, but ethically oriented, common good oriented. No speculations. I think this is clear, although we have to go into detail. Then, very important. Maybe that's the second most important point. Economists today, when do they regard an investment as successful? When it generates a return on investment. And is it a spiritual return on investment? Is it it's a financial return on investment. And if the financial return on investment is double digit, do they say, watch out, it's becoming dangerous? Or do they, say, great, it's a double digit return on financial return on investment? Now it's my question as a non-economist, or as a true economist. Does a double-digit return on investment tell us anything reliable of the impact, of the effect of that very investment on the environment, on the global climate, on the social cohesion, distribution, human dignity, gender relation, or democracy? Nothing at all. It might even occur that a double-digit financial return on investment project diminishes all these fundamental values and expropriates these common goods and makes society poorer. doesn't contribute to the wealth of the nation, but to the poverty of the nation. And economists, actually we're talking about chrematists disguised as economists, consider that investment as successful. Isn't that perverted? Solution, make first the more important creditworthiness assessment, because looking at the resources is not a bad idea. That's very important information, but it's not the most important information. The most important information is how this project contributes to the goals and values of a democratic society. That's why we check first its consequences on our fundamental values and common goods. And only if nothing is damaged, only if that evaluation is not negative, only then we make the financial creditworthiness assessment, and if both are passed, the money flows. And it flows under the better conditions, the higher the added social and ecological value of the project is, which we measure with the ethical creditworthiness assessment. Okay. Maybe I close now. I close. With the Italian law says that the inequality between the highest wages and lowest wages within the bank must not exceed 5 times. 5 times. Do you know what's the highest inequality in Germany at the moment? 8,500 times. And in the US, 360,000 times. And of course, it's a hedge fund manager. Okay, so how do I close? I close with the Bavarian Constitution. No, sorry, can I ask for a last minute? This, yeah, so once we have a legal definition for ethical banking, we have some examples of ethical banks. And what do we do with those who are not? Paradoxic intervention, we release them to the free markets, which means we free them of any public support. And this will have a strong impact on profit-oriented bank, because we will not prohibit profit-oriented bank in a first step, maybe in a second step, and for that I will give an argument from the Bavarian Constitution, but in the first step it's sufficient to welcome them to the really free markets, and look what they will lose. They will lose probably their viability. And is this excessive? Yeah, very important. The small ones, the ethical ones, regulate them in a lower degree than the big ones. That's very important, because otherwise we are strongly regulated. There is a tendency to extinguish all small regional and ethical banks, regulating them in the same way as the big ones. Of course, this is equal treatment. This is non-demonstration. But if you treat equally the flyweight in boxing and the super heavyweight, yeah, I think that's unfair, and that's an abuse of the term non-discrimination. And why I think that in a second step we could even think about not admitting to markets profit-oriented banks, because that's not their purpose. And we find it already in constitutions that tell us something precisely about the monetary and credit system. And they say the purpose is the creation of use values, something that we can eat or wear or live in, but not the creation of more money. So a loan to increase assets or money would be anti-constitutional if we take this serious. And this is just my last argument, that in a true economy, maybe all banks would even be common good oriented and not profit oriented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christian Felber, for your brilliant expose. Very interesting. Sorry, we have to cut it short. So, indeed, what alternative exists for mainstream commercial banks? Some banks decide to operate in a way that's positive for society, and its environment that take into account all stakeholders, not only shareholders. Some appeared and are operational since a while, like Banca Etica or GLS. Some are more work in progress, like NewB or Bank for Common Good. These banks, or banks to be, have in common the will to integrate strong ethical values in their banking operations. They want to maximize societal value, increase accountability, and highly value participation. I'd like to invite our panelists to come to discuss about this. First of all, I'd like to introduce Tom Ollinger, who used to work for different European banks like Crélan and Crédit Agricole, and now leads the NewB project, which, as you all know, is a cooperative that will become a bank one day. Some services are already operational, such as prepaid cards. Some are to come, such as insurance products. He will have a practitioner angle to this debate. Then there is Benoît Lallemand, which has also a past in the mainstream financial industry. Since 2011, he works for Finance Watch since the very beginning, and is now its general secretary since 2 years. Finance Watch is a European NGO that has as a slogan to make finance serve society. There he initiated the Citizens Dashboard of Finance, which is a platform that allows a broad range of stakeholders to engage on global campaign to change finance. He will bring to this discussion panel his European experience in ethical banking. And last, but certainly not least, Professor Luc van Liedekerke. He's a professor at Leuven and Antwerp universities, and a specialist in banking ethics, and also the chairman of the Etibel Forum's registration committee. His knowledge of market trends and global thinking on ethics should shed an academic light to our exchanges. To start the discussions and let Christian take his breath, there's another microphone just on the table if you wish, or as you wish. The idea is that I ask a question to each new panelist coming on the stage and to have an answer in 5-10 minutes. And then we will ask questions. The public would also be able to ask questions. So, maybe, first of all, I will put a presentation here. Up. Tom has a few... sorry? Okay. Just a minute. That's what happens when you do two things at the same time. From the beginning. Voilà. I let you speak, Tom.
Merci beaucoup, Annika. Thank you very much, Christian. What you said was very inspiring for NewB. I think I have got just one number in my presentation, and I've got it right. So I will tell you later. Chers coopérateurs, chères coopératrices, beste vrienden, I think that most of you know NewB. It's well known as a project in Belgium. Christian, so we are not a bank yet. We are working on becoming an ethical and sustainable bank. NewB is built on values, and my presentation will talk about the values of NewB. Every month you get paid or you receive your pension. That's very fine, but at the same time it's a very strange moment because you do not know what your bank does with your money. Does it invest in coal industry? Does it help to distribute glyphosate, or does it fuel speculation? All these things will end the day we create NewB Bank and that you will become client of NewB. Because NewB will give you the guarantee that nothing evil, nothing bad happens with your salary, with your money. Why can we guarantee that? Because we are built on values. There are 13 values we engage to respect. They are written in our articles of associations, dans nos statuts, and we are also sure to respect them because we have two democratic instances. We have our General Assembly where our cooperators vote each year. If you come on 9th of June to the Théâtre Saint-Michel, you will see hundreds of cooperators voting. And they will prevent us from doing things which are not in conformity with our values. We have also a societal committee, Märzkaplik Committee, which are a group of independent people which have access to all our documents, to all our meetings, and who will blow the whistle if something bad happens, if there's a mission drift. I want to talk about our HR policy because HR means salary, money, and such as Christian said, money has tendency to do good things but also to pervert. Inside NewB, there are and will be no bonuses because we think that bonuses are linked to an unsustainable approach of banking. It leads to excessive risk taking, to sell too many products to the client, products which are not transparent, not ethical, not simple, and which are of no use very often for the economy. We think that bankers should not be paid more because they take more risk. They should just be paid because they give a service honest, normal to their clients. You know also that those who take excessive risks are not the ones who save afterwards the bank by paying with the money they've got in form of bonuses. I was talking about the number I got right at NewB. Christian, the person which is the best paid, does not get more than 5 times the lowest salary. We think that high salaries are dangerous because they lead to greedy attitudes and because they take away the people who get a lot of money from normal life. They disconnect people from normal life. Third thing about HR, NewB gives no company cars. We think that Brussels, Antwerpen are already sufficiently polluted and congested. Very often we get the question, why do you want to create a bank? Today, fintech is better. Why don't you work on cryptocurrencies or blockchain? There are 3 reasons. Very often we find that these new techniques are not related to ethics or to values. But we also, it's the most important reason, we believe in the fundamentals of a bank which collects deposits and transforms these deposits in credits. And by credits we mean local credits, ethical credits, and that's something which gives fuel to a normal ethical economy. So it's very important for us. There's also a third reason why we want to become a bank, because in Belgium, as you know, perhaps a salary must be paid on a bank account. So to give you the guarantee that nothing bad will happen with your salary, we have to become a bank. Innovation and proximity. Innovation. What's innovation for the banks which have run us in the financial crisis of 2007? Innovation for these banks, which very often still exist, is to develop complex financial products or new marketing techniques just to maximize their profit without any social benefit. For us, NewB, innovation will be fundamental, simple banking products which are transparent and useful. It will be also to be at the top of social and ecological criteria. We will use new techniques if it's useful, if it's in favor of inclusion, participation, etc. To give you an example, we plan to be a 100% online bank, but we have to use also different techniques, new techniques, to help customers which are less agile with internet. For example, some of elder people or people with a handicap. Then technique is useful. A question we are very often asked is, when will NewB be a bank? Well, I can't tell you for certain if NewB will become a bank. I can't tell you when, but I can tell you that we work with a lot of effort and conviction on this project, and we have the feeling, my colleagues at NewB, myself, that we have never been so close to becoming a bank. There are two important conditions which really have to be satisfied before we become a bank. We will have to raise more capital. NewB's capital is not sufficient today. What regulators ask is quite important in terms of capital. I won't criticize this position. It's easier for Christian because he's freer. I think it's justified that NewB needs more capital, and we will probably come back, we'll certainly come back in 2018 to you, the public, to ask you to help us to raise more capital. We will also have to recruit talented, experienced people, value-driven, to run the new bank, and a lot of these people will have to be experienced bankers which will join NewB to run the new bank. So what's next in the coming months? We will be quite busy. We will launch insurance products in the coming months. We will come with a new corporate identity, and you have seen some signs, some parts of the new corporate identity on the screen. We will also come with a new website because we have to explain more to make it easier for new clients to comprehend what NewB is, what our values are. And we, very important also, still have the objective to issue 3 new good pay cards on average every day. You know, it's important for NewB that you use our products. It's a sign for the regulator that you are interested in NewB, so please use our products. Please also become cooperator of NewB if you still are not a cooperator. Christian. All this serves the bank, NewB, and becoming a bank is our #1 priority. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you very much for supporting NewB.
Thank you, Tom, for your explanations. Now I'd like to ask Benoit to come and tell us a bit about Finance Watch Change Finance campaign. 10 years after the crisis, how do you see the path to sustainable finance?
So it's great to be here and to see so many of you. I think that's already very positive news, and I really look forward to an interactive discussion. So I will try to to be very short. I think on the key theme, does ethical banking works? I think it does in a way. What Tom explained is just a proof of that. But I think, as Christian alluded to, there's also something about legal changes and the mainstream. I think to be a bit provocative, I think at this stage we are not very, I mean, if you like, the mainstream or the system we know today is not very worried. We are not a worrying group here for them. If that doesn't change, then ethical banking works as a nice niche in a small corner, but nothing changes. So I think that is the challenge. That is why I go to work every day. So I will talk for just a few minutes about Finance Watch, not just to give you a history lesson, because I think, but because I think it teaches us a few things about changing finance and what works and what does not work. And as you guess, this is a very small world. I'm a co-operator of NewB. Finance Watch as an organization is a member of NewB. Financité is a member of Finance Watch, and I could go on. I was actually, when I was younger, one of the founders of Attac in Brussels, just in the few weeks after the editorial of Ignacio Ramonet in the Monde Diplomatique. So yeah, very, very small world, I think, which probably is a problem. It's comfortable, but it probably is a problem. It's too small. So who had heard or who knew Finance Watch before registering to this event? Be very honest. Okay, well that's not bad, but it's, yeah. So I would say maybe 30% of you, but it's probably not a very representative sample, as I said. And the reason is we were created in 2011 in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Christian alluded to that, but so very briefly in 2008 you had the big financial crisis, and then for a few months the G20, well, all the politicians said never again, blah, 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 and then they met with the G20 in Pittsburgh in late 2009, and that's where they decided on their agenda actually not to change the financial system, but they called it post-crisis financial regulation. That, if you like, in a certain way, that's where the ambition was killed. They all agreed that instead of looking at the fundamental issues, so what happened over the last 25 years, so deregulation, financialization, and I could go on. That is what led to the crisis. For most people in the street, I think that was obvious. Even people who are not literate in these subjects, that the crisis was only the symptom or the result of fundamental things that had been going on for 20 or 30 years. Globalization, but a certain type of globalization. The G20 said, no. We're not going to discuss any of that. What we're going to do is make sure that when the next crisis hits, because crisis happens, it's like tsunamis, I'll come back to that. Well, we need to make sure that that time the citizens or the taxpayers do not get hurt. And as I always say, as I often say, the only way to avoid a tsunami to hit coastal villages, if the coastal villages are the citizens and the tsunami are banking losses, that's what happened with the crisis, the only way to avoid that the tsunami hits the coastal village is to avoid the tsunami to happen. Anyone who's heard about what a tsunami is knows building embankments does not help. For big waves, yes, not for a tsunami. But so that was the ambition of the G20, is to build embankments to make sure that when the next tsunami comes, and so it's capital requirements, it's making sure the debtors of the bank take the hits, etc. But of course that didn't work for any reason. So to keep it short, we were created then in 2011, so 2 years later, because the ambition, or the lack of ambition, if you like, of the G20 started to be translated into mainly Brussels and Washington into legislation. So legislation to re-regulate finance. And so people like Sven Giegold and members of the European Parliament realized, but again, that they should have realized, not people like Sven, but they realized there were no counterweight. So on one specific piece of legislation, indeed, they would have 100 meetings, and maybe 1 or 2 meetings were with people outside of the financial sector. So the financial sector is diverse. There are hedge funds, bankers, markets, and then maybe there were, I don't know, Oxfam or one union who would have one very specific angle, but probably not the level of technical details to really wade in. So Finance Watch was created, and for 4 or 5 years the idea was, let's use the maximum of this momentum for regulation from a public interest point of view. And we failed, you know, that's okay. I mean, you all know we failed. You said it, the financial system did not change. I think you were even a bit too positive, saying maybe we have a bit less of this and that. Maybe, but maybe it's not even because of regulation, it's just because of market trends. And so it didn't really change. And that's okay, because I think we needed to build this counterweight. We need some people, you know, from citizens, from the public interest, to understand financial regulation in detail, and so we continue to do that. But so what I want to focus on now, for 2 minutes before I finish, is that after 5 or 6 years of doing that, we took a step back and thought, okay, this is not working. So if you have an agenda that has been defined and is not ambitious enough, then making the most of that agenda, again, is not enough. And anyway, we are not strong enough to play that counterweight. So Finance Watch from the beginning was a membership organization, but we invested less in developing that membership and more in the technical stuff. Again, I think that was necessary. But so what we call now the second phase of our existence, or Finance Watch 2.0, if you want to call it, is investing much more in building that membership, building a coalition of actors, and it's NGOs, it's citizens. It is crucially what we call the pioneering practitioners. Let's call them the pioneers, which are people like Christian or like NewB, doing things differently already. You know, showing it's not a dream. It's you can actually do it differently. So NGOs, citizens, practitioners. But academia as well, because we know from experience there are a lot of people very expert and very supportive, but they are fragmented. They are all over the place, and so we don't have this sort of, we do not manage to have enough power to weight in the balance because we are not united. So the idea is to use the 10th anniversary of the crisis. You know, on 15 September this year, this will be the 10th anniversary of the collapse of Lehman, which was a bit symbolic as the peak of the collapse of the financial system, to launch a campaign to change finance. We've done that in the past, you know, campaigns to change finance, but hopefully this time we managed to get the momentum, but also to get the broad coalition to make it work, and this time to really set the agenda on our own terms. And I think just to finish, I'd like to relate also to what's happening, other things that are happening in the world, the discontent we see from citizens to politicians. So, you know, stuff like Trump, stuff like Brexit, I think shows that citizens will not take it anymore. I mean, I think there is something very positive underlying beneath that, which is that citizens, they just want change. They will not take the status quo anymore. And I would argue, when I was a bit younger and creating Attack in Brussels, and I was idealist, but I'm still very idealist. But I think actually the potential for real radical change was much lower then. It's much, much bigger now. I mean, the crisis has deepened, so in a way it's more depressing because the stakes are much higher. We are much closer to some sort of collapse, but at the same time the potential for change and the support for people for radical change has never been bigger. I think unfortunately it's the wrong kind of people who now step out and say, well, I promise you radical change, me, Donald Trump of all people, or Nigel Farage, but I think it shows that that's what we need to do as well in our camp, on our side. And I do think focusing on finance and more specifically the financialization of the economy, so it's not just about regulating banks, it's about undoing 25 years of financialization. I think this sort of campaign can actually help to support a shift of paradigm, which is much more fundamental, which is what we need if we need to avoid collapse. So this is what we'll be focusing on, and you will certainly hear from us about this campaign in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, a new change. Now I'd like to invite Professor Van Liedekerke here. And on the same idea, what would be the main developments for the banking market in the coming years? What kind of place is there for ethics? And what kind of models, banking models, are or will be more resilient? Thank you.
Thank you. So let me first a personal story. It seems that Attack is a kind of liaison here. Not that I'm a member of ATTAC, but I was invited at the time, and I did some work on the Tobin tax. And so I was invited by the people of ATTAC, and I was even invited by the French president, and I even went to the United Nations, where I was invited to speak for 5 minutes to the General Assembly about the Tobin tax, and everybody was asleep. So yes, they're not afraid of us. Yeah, so, yeah, that's clear. Okay, well, one is, the first point I want to make is a kind of personal frustration. So I've been teaching financial ethics for some years, and so yeah, you think there's a crisis. The thing is really collapsed. So what you have to reckon is when a financial system collapses, it has a huge impact on society. So it's very different than when, let's say, a car factory or a steel factory collapses. Why? Because it's the spider in the web. Huh? It really sits in the nucleus of our economic system. And so when that collapses, the entire system collapses. Now we were very close to a total collapse. Now total collapse would mean that you would not be able to get money from the bank, no matter how much money you have. And don't think that doesn't happen. It did happen in Greece, it happens in Argentina. Every 10 years they have it in Argentina, so it keeps coming back. Yeah? Now a total collapse means that nobody can get the money out of the wall. Huh? So you were limited to, let's say, 200-300 euros or something like that. Can you imagine what that means for an economy and for a society? This is the type of collapse we're talking about. We were just that close to this collapse, but the payment system continued, luckily enough. So what happened to the education in finance? Well, nothing, eh? Well, so let me make an analogy. Suppose, because this is what happened in Belgium, we lost, let's say, 85% of our banking system in a couple of weeks. Now suppose for a moment that you have 85% of the bridges in this country collapsing in 3 weeks. What do you think happens to the education of engineers? What will happen to the theories they use? Yeah? I mean, I suppose we would ask questions, no? Nothing. There's one place where I teach financial ethics where they have a full course, and that's the only place that I know where people are trained in finance that they have a course on financial ethics. That's about it. That's the only place. Nothing changed. So that's a personal frustration. I leave it with you, but I think it's really a scandal. So these people, and they are the best people we have at university, they train in finance because this is where the money is, they're still trained in a way as if there is no such thing as ethics. Yeah, nothing. Yeah, so that I think is a big failure. Now, I have a couple of critical remarks with what we heard so far. Too big to fail. Yes, that there's a problem, that is an issue. But one of the things you have to realize is this is not a separate issue. If you have large banks, it is because the scale of our economies has expanded so much. You have large banks because you have large companies. Yeah. There is no way that you can support a globalized economic system with local small banks. There is no way. Yeah? So I think you have to be aware of that. Then you have to make a choice. Right? It's not just a choice about big or small banks, it's a choice also about a big or a small economy. Now do not underestimate what that means. If you look at economic historians, and you would reduce now the economic system to a local economic system, you would create immense poverty. Eh? It is not the enormous increase in wealth that we have since the 20th century. Yeah? That has had enormous impact in many countries. I don't know if you're familiar with your Human Development Index, but if you look at the China of Mao Zedong, they had a Human Development Index around 0.2 or something. Yeah? So, and in some regions it was not even 0.1. In the beginning of the 20th century in Asia it was 0.05, the Human Development Index. What does that mean? That means that 90% of the population cannot read and write. Yeah? That means that people have a life expectancy of about 35 years when they're born. That means that people live in chronicle shortage. That you have always people living, the majority of your population lived on the edge of starvation. That was the situation in the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah. Under Mao Zedong, we moved to 0.3. Now China is at 0.8. That is, we consider that more or less arrived. That's more or less a normal situation. Yeah. There's no way that China could have grown so fast without the globalization movement. No way. So be aware of what you choose. Be aware. I'm not defending here big banks. I'm not saying that it's good. I think it's a huge problem. Yeah? But big companies might also be seen as a huge problem, but it's part of a globalization movement. And if you throw it away, you throw away a lot, really a lot. So don't underestimate it. So what do we need? Do we need new banks or do we need to change the old banks? Well, I would say we need both. We need both. I've been working with ATBL since '92. Very much aware of all kinds of new initiatives and so on, and I like it. I call it a kind of innovation. It's innovation in your society, innovation in your financial system. I think we need it. We need to innovate our society because of what comes up. There are all kinds of challenges, and they come very fast. Don't underestimate it. We see it coming year after year. And so yes, you need this type of innovation in these new initiatives like the NewB initiative and all the other examples we got. I agree with that. But if you would rely on that, it will take ages before we are large enough. You need to change the existing system, whether you like it or not. You will be simply too late if you want to build from the new banks. Yeah? You need both. So one of the things I did in my life at a certain point is not only did I work with ATBL, I still work with these people, but I also started working with large banks. And I tried to have a dialogue with them. I still do that. And try to change the internal struggle. Because, you know, bankers are not all crazy, bad people. You know? They are people like you and me. Huh? They live in a system. And some have ideas that maybe we should change in this direction, and others don't agree. So you have all kinds of people, like you have in every place in society. So you find people inside banks that you can work with in order to move a bank in a certain direction. So what did I do? What kind of direction am I talking about? And then I think is really part of also the central thing in this new banking system is I deeply agree with the idea that money is not a neutral good. That means money has a color. Yeah? In the financial crisis, suppose you have a bike, a bicycle. Yeah? You have a bicycle. And so what happened in the financial crisis is that people started selling you a bicycle without brakes. And then they were betting on the fact that you would collapse somewhere or that you would crash. That's what Goldman Sachs did. They sell you a good which they know that will crash, and then they bet on the fact and they gain their money by the fact that you will crash. Only in finance can you sell such goods. In the real world, it would be impossible to sell a car without brakes. Impossible. So that's what I mean when I say that money is a kind of a neutral good in the normal perception. This has to change, fundamentally to change. We have to see where the money comes from, where it goes to. We have to know what the impact of money is. We have to measure the impact of money. Now what I do see, and I agree with the previous speaker, that there is now momentum for change even more than during the crisis, is that the big banks start thinking about that. They start thinking about impact. They start thinking about extending the idea of risk and return. Yeah, they see that it might be a risk to invest in coal. And I know big banks that have stopped investing in tobacco, that have stopped investing in coal, and it really costs them money. But they start to see that it makes a difference. And that it might be even good business to start thinking about these things. So we call that in finance now that we look more and more at ESG information, environmental, social governance information. These things are happening. Do we need them? Yes. Are they perfect? Far from. Is there still a long way to go? Tremendously long way to go. But work both ways. Not just the new banks, which I think you need, but also the old banks, which I think we cannot neglect and where we have to work with. That's my position. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask our panelists to come on the stage. Time flies when you're having fun. I suggest that we go directly to hear your questions in the public. If you have questions for any of our panelists on different topics that have been evoked tonight, maybe on critical size for banks, maybe on mission drift. Are there any questions in the public? If there are none. One at the back. Is someone for the microphone? Okay. Sorry, it's coming.
My name is Francis from the Democracy in Europe movement, and I would like to know, I agree with the statement of the last speaker that we also need to reform the established banks, and I was wondering whether they're here, or whether we're just praying to the converted, or whether we can actually, you know, try to infiltrate them in a way to speak at their events, get them to these events, and to have more of a dialogue to really bring this transition about. That's my question.
Thank you for the question. So we had Professor Van Liedekerke explaining that he has dialogues with these different bigger banks. Maybe we can hear other panelists on this question.
First. Who are they? You're talking about the board, the owners, the clients, the employees. Be aware that you're not talking about natural persons, you're talking about legal persons. And in these banks that are too big to fail, who is your vis-a-vis? And even if the CEO, as a person, as a natural person, is totally in favor of everything that has been said, he has to obey his owners and the shareholders. And the shareholders are the investment funds and the pension funds and the hedge funds, and they are not interested. And then who is this big corporation? And as I so much agreed on what has been said, and I want to become a cooperativist of NewB, if I can. And also what you said, Professor, but I so much disagreed on one point that I ask if I can express my disagreement on that point. I deeply disagree that globalization would not be possible with smaller banks. You said the alternative is not to globalize or not to globalize, but the alternative in my view is to globalize with smaller non-financial companies who need smaller banks. But I don't want to have companies of the size neither of Monsanto nor of Bayer. Monsanto is already, although it's 3 times smaller than Bayer, it's already so powerful that although 90% of the citizens in the USA desire a transparent labeling of GMO on the food they buy, there is no labeling. Why? Because the power of Monsanto is bigger than that of 90% of the citizens in the US. So I want smaller companies than Monsanto, and then a smaller company of Monsanto can deal with smaller banks. But my question, because I also have a question to you, if I can back to my slides, if you say that 30 billion, please, yes, if you say that 30 billion as a maximum size is too small, my question is, what's your proposal? Shall there be no limit, or do you just advocate a higher limit? This is this is the way our conventions work. The conventions work with several proposals. It's totally clear that citizens would vote, yes, there shall be a size limit. But then comes the more interesting question, where shall it be? And maybe if 30 billion is too small, maybe you advocate for 100 billion or for 200 billion, but would you advocate for no limit? And then we are entering in a bit more meaningful discussion.
I think you, in a sense, you misunderstood. My point is that you have to make a choice. It's not just that you limit the size of banks. At the same time, you will limit the size of firms. So it's a choice. So then you limit both. You limit the size of economic systems. Yeah, and I disagree in the sense that I don't know, and nobody knows actually exactly. But suppose you make that transition. I mean, the fact that we had this globalization movement, that they became so large, there is a reason for that, and it had a huge impact. Of course, you create powerful powerful players. And there is a problem in the sense that we globalized economically, but not politically. And that is the challenge today. So I will not choose. I think it's a choice that you as a room can make, but be aware, it's not just talking about banks, it's also talking about firms and about the economy in general. Choose small banks, limit the size of bank, limit the size of firms at the same time. That's what we will get. Now the other thing, if you talk to banks, who do you talk to? It's with small banks and it's with big banks like that. In the end, there is always a group leading these organizations. And so they come and go, yes, but the best you can do is talk directly to these people. Now they have to answer to hedge funds and all the other stuff. You know, I know 2 hedge funds who are specialized in ESG. These things did not exist before. They only focus on impact investment and where they could find the money there. You have now companies like BlackRock. It's not just the banks that have this change process going on. It's also the big investment companies like a BlackRock. BlackRock is in every firm in the world. It's huge. It's 4 or 5 trillion. For the first time, they start speaking out against weapons in the US, against the fact that there's climate problems and so on. For the first time, I'm not saying that makes a big difference, but there is an opportunity now in the entire system, I would say, definitely in the European part of that system, less in the American, and almost nothing in the Asian part, unfortunately. But here we have an opportunity to talk to these people. And why? Because they feel the pressure coming from the public and from different sides. It comes from everywhere. They feel the pressure, and they are aware of it.
Anyone wants to comment on momentum?
Yes, thank you. I'm not quite so optimistic. I think you have 3 sectors, which are pharmacy, agrobusiness, and finance, where you have 3 things. It's complexity, greed, and hugeness, very big. And if you mix the 3, because the question is religion. So if you mix the 3, the fact that you have a very big company, complexity of products, and greed, you have a natural movement which will come back, that you will create complex, dangerous products which are very profitable on a short term, economically but not socially, and which will get out of the hands of their creator or of the hand of top management, which does not understand anymore what people do on lower levels. That's what happened with the financial crisis. I don't know if it happens inside Monsanto, if they know what they're doing with glyphosate. And so, Professor Liedekerk, I agree what you say, that it's getting better, but I think the movement of betterment is so small when you consider the huge power of doing bad things, that I must say I'm not very optimistic.
There are questions in the room. I saw one in the back and one for the lady here. Yes, sir?
Yeah. We hear more and more speak about monetary reform based on the Chicago Plan, sovereign money and so on. I would like to have to know what you think about the Vollgeld initiative in Switzerland, the initiative money plan, who will be voted in June, I think. Yeah.
Well, I will not respond myself, but you actually have an organization in the room called Positive Money Europe. We're very proud that they sit in our offices at Finance Watch. So you have 2 representatives there, so I encourage you to go to them and talk. You probably know them already. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's a key element, in fact, of what led to the crisis. You know, when we come to how the agenda was set, actually, I would even argue that the crisis was more related to monetary policy and you know, very cheap creation of money leading up to 2008 than actually a lack of regulation of the banks. I mean, this is a bit provocative, but actually the macroeconomic side of it was was absolutely crucial. So do you want to?
One of the former CEOs of the UBS is in favor of positive money, so it can't be that a bad idea. I'm of course in the supporters committee. I even proposed to develop from positive to sovereign money, which would be a further step. And there are so many advantages. I started a short paper of 10 pages and tried to figure out which are the strongest arguments in favor, and still I don't know, because there are so many. One is that public debt could be cut down to half or by 3/4 in countries like Switzerland, Germany, and I guess also Belgium. But maybe, as we heard, that there was almost a global meltdown of the financial markets due to payment services. Almost payment services stopped. That would be one of the 15 advantages of positive money, that the payment system could not break down because it would be separated from the credit and savings system of the banks. It would be separated from the balance sheets of banks, and it would be 100% secure central bank money, which we would use for our paying purposes. And maybe just that would be a strong enough argument in favor of that reform.
Maybe just one comment before we take the question from the lady.
Well, the thing is, you always have to be careful who regulates the money stream. So there will be always regulation somewhere. And the question is who does it and what kind of intentions. So you have Chinese banks are not free market banks. They are in the hands of the governments. Yeah, but what type of government? How do they use it? If you look at the DRC, Congo, so the debt of Congo was equal to the fortune of Mr. Mobutu. Yeah. So I mean that's the problem. So and it's all very well to say we have to be, you have to refer to the common good. But look at the elections in Italy now. That's the problem in democracies. If you live in pluralistic societies, so where is the common good? You might be surprised about what your neighbor considers to be common good. Yeah. So it's a big discussion. It's not easy. It's not easy. So I think the positive money and so on, it's a nice idea, but one of the effects will be that your capital markets will become so much smaller. Again, you will not be able to support the large economic structures we have now, so be aware of it. Be aware of it.
Yes?
I have a dilemma, which brings the topic back to our lives. The dilemma is, first of all, what I often see is that the systemic analysis is not coinciding with personal behavior. So we have criticized and we have moralized and we have been activists, but then when I see personal financial choices, I see them repeating the default settings all the time and therefore making the same mistakes and the same systemic, producing themselves as a person, the systemic wrongdoings. And my question, my dilemma to you is, do we first change the system and have systemic change to provide a framework for very economic illiterate people, and there are lots of them, to function in? Or actually, do we have to wait for the democratic, to the level of everybody being educated in money and finance and in economics in part one, to be able to actually then evolve through personal change towards systemic change? So systemic change for persons or personal change for systemics?
Yes, Christian.
Always has to be both. It's not an either-or question. Maybe the sequence is only if there is a certain market or practice or role models, only then you can get the critical mass for regulation. But I don't know a single example where a voluntary, intrinsically motivated ethical practice became mainstream without the support of laws. And the good message of the so-called cognitive dissonance you're talking about, people behave differently from how they think or talk. They don't walk, they talk. has a good message, because if they could decide as political citizens on the regulations and the laws, they would vote for regulations and laws that incentivize them as economic citizens to behave in a more ethical way, to become ethical investors, to become ethical consumers, and that's why the combination of both is essential.
Yes.
Professor?
Oh, yeah.
No, I agree with previous speaker, but I would like to say that, so people always tell me, well, people are not consistent. My students, yeah, they are younger generation. Still, they want their own car. They want to work for a company that gives them a company car. Yeah. So nothing changes in that respect. No, but if you ask my students, do we need to look at the quality of the air? Will you vote for cleaner air? They have no doubt whatsoever. So they're shooting in their own foot, but that's how people are. So if people, I'm sure if I ask the question here, who speeds on the highway, I'm sure that the majority, let's say almost 90% will speed on the highway. We have data on that. Everybody does it. Then I ask my students, will we eliminate this law since we all break it? Nobody wants to eliminate it. It's crazy. I mean, that's the reason why you have to pay, yeah? But we don't eliminate it. So there are two ways you have to look at persons. You are indeed a citizen, and you are a consumer. And we are not consistent. But what we do see is that it moves in terms of the citizen, we see movement. If you now look at financial companies, they have discovered the fact that people might like SRI, so responsible investment, and they see that it's money for them. Incredible. People are now seeing that, well, maybe if it's the same risk return, why not invest it ethically? They are flowing. I mean, they are like the new money that comes in, like 30–40% of the big banks in private investment goes to an ethical investment now. It's totally new for them. It's totally new. So I mean, these things are actually changing. Are they changing fast enough? I don't know. I would say not at all. Yeah, but do not think that there is no potential for change. Even in the entire system, there is potential for change.
Did you have something you wanted to add?
One cent, but the quintessence of the question, if you ask the citizens, would you support that ethical banks are legally supported and treated better than unethical banks, you would gain a broad majority. And then ethical banks would enter markets and become more in number and competitive.
One last, and then we go back to questions from the public.
Yes, to amplify this, you have to give us a choice. If there's no NewB of similar bank, of no Triodos in a country, you have to put the first one, the second one, and then you create a market, and there will be people for this kind of bank, and so you change something.
Any other questions? Yes, the lady in the middle. Indeed, we saw, we as Financité, we follow the socially responsible investment market, and indeed between 2015 and 2016 we saw a big jump. So there is momentum, at least we see it this way.
Hello, I want to ask, like nowadays investment is a big part of banking life, and these loans were given for investments. How can we guarantee that they are like greens or ethics? Need we regulation, perhaps in the European Union?
Thank you for the question. I think many of us can answer this. Maybe you would like to say something about it?
So the question is, how do you define an investment or a credit that is green? Was that your question?
Yeah, it's exactly like we can speak about green loans. It's like 1% of the loans are green, but of this 1%, not every loan is green. How would be that guarantee?
Yeah. So I think 1% is even too much. So the only substantial market in greenness is green bonds, and currently banks can label green their own bonds themselves, right? So you would guess that 90% of them are not really green.
Exactly.
But so the main point to understand here is that we have completely abandoned any say on the allocation. So we talked about stability, we talked about the amount of capital they hold, and the stability of the financial system. What we haven't talked about is purpose. because purpose has been excluded, because it's the efficient market hypothesis. So markets will distribute the money efficiently, but quite crucially, it means so now we have a big discussion, if you follow a bit the news in Europe, about sustainable finance and green finance, and how will we finance the COP21 and the Sustainable Development goals. And then, of course, it's always the same situation. You go, okay, governments are broke, and of course we accept that as a given. We don't question the fact that governments are broke. And then everyone turns to the private financial sector. And then people turn to them saying, okay, so the money is there and it needs to flow there. and then people start to get on their knees and literally pray, saying, well, please, Mr. Big Banker or Big Investor, would you please move some money there? But the reality is that there is no pressure point at all. I mean, there are pressure points in regulation about how much money they need to hold in case they go bankrupt, so stability. But there has been nothing, as I said, in terms of the G20 agenda, nothing, not even the start of a discussion about how the money is allocated, so to which sector, in which way, how do you measure that? That's the discussion is only beginning now. So that's I think that is a big issue.
And that banks, by law, have to do risk assessment of the loans that consider to finance. That's the Basel III criteria. That's not a voluntary exercise. That's legally binding. It's compliance. But all they have to check is the financial risk. And they do not have to check the ethical risk, from human rights to climate stability. And one leverage could be that the future generations of Basel regulation switch from the financial risk check to the, they call it non-financial risk check, but it's ethical and non-ethical risk check, actually the other way around. And the analogy is already occurring. The analogy between a company's financial balance sheet. There are not 25 options to do a corporate or a company's financial balance sheet. There is one unified methodology which is legally binding in all member states of the European Union, which is externally audited by financial auditors and which has legal consequences, from liability over tax consequences, and Austrian courts shut down a company which does not comply with its duty to give this financial information. What we are now working on is that the non-financial information, which sometimes is called GRI, a Global Compact, ISO 26000, B corporations or Common Good Balance Sheet, is becoming a full analogy to the financial balance sheet, meaning we unify them into one legally binding, externally audit Common Good Balance Sheet with legal consequences, means differentiated tax rates, tariff rates, priority in public procurement, or differentiated loan conditions. And the very same we do with investments and with loans. Banks are obliged by law to do the ethical risk assessment of every loan that is applied by a business or by a private person. And only if this, today we can struggle about how can we define a common good. And you're right, it's a difficult, extremely difficult, but in the end, we will have a definition. In the same way that in the end, we have laws that treat on liberty, that treat on social justice and social security, on democracy and on peace, because we in the end, we found a definition. What is peace? What is human dignity? What are human rights? What is liberty and what is democracy? And in the same way, we will find a kind of definition of the common good in the ethical creditworthiness assessment, and we will apply it. And if parliaments are not ready to impose this second risk assessment to banks, then maybe citizens will.
Yes.
Just following up, I think when the question was asked, I think ethics is extremely fragile. If you say, I have an ethical investment and I'm an ethical person, well, we've seen it with Oxfam. If you're a company, if you're an organization that does good things in the world, and they do good things in the world, let that be clear. But if then something happens, which happens in all organizations probably, it has an extreme influence on the perception. So you have to be careful when you say this is an ethical investment or this is a green investment. And you have to be even more careful with this kind of stuff than with the non-green, let's say, or the non-ethical investments. So I am very much in favor that you have a broad discussion on what will be a minimal norm for ethical investments. What will be a minimum norm for green investment? And I'm very much in favor that the financial regulator starts looking at this. Now, again, all these things are happening. We are in Belgium discussing about a minimal norm that is not just procedure, but that has content. We are seeing that the FSMA, the financial regulator, is looking at this. Now, why is the financial regulator looking at this? Because you have so many people now going into SRI. So the financial regulator needs to look at the clients and needs to look that they don't get sold rubbish. So they now want to know. And they know nothing about it. So they have to start from scratch, really. It's completely new to them. But again, these things are not coming. Now, when you say the non-financial reporting and so on in companies, again, these things are growing. I've been part of that movement also. And if you look at financial reporting, it started in the 1930s with the financial crisis. That's when it started. It was all voluntary. And the legal framework came only in the 1950s, 60s, and in our places even later. It really took a long time. If I look back when we started discussing about sustainability reports in business, well, that's 20 years ago. Before that, there was nothing. So the change is going faster than people think. Why? Because you and I have certain values, and because our values are changing. Because, for instance, we don't like when animals are mistreated, and we react to that. Now, if I'm an investor, I want to know what this company does. Because otherwise I won't invest. So how do I convince a big bank that there might be something in it? Because we have data showing that a company that takes care of non-financial stuff, of environmental stuff and so on, is less risk for a bank. We have data on that. And so the cost of capital of these firms goes down. So they start measuring it. And if the private sector thinks there is something in it, it can go really fast. But you have to push it, you have to push it.
I see more hands raised. There's one in the back and then Lieve in the front.
I have a question because you speak about banks, a lot of banks. I work in a bank. I'm really surprised that to limit for you to give more democracy. It will be the type of project. It could be I heard a lot about product. But myself, a bank is not only a seller of product. And if you don't change this, the bank will not change. The change in the bank is really normally a services give to people who don't know what they are, sometimes what they are doing. They don't even know what risk they will take. And that's, for me, is the most important. And I heard a lot new banks, and after I heard new product and so on. That's not this. And by doing this, you know what? You really decrease and you take power of people because they don't even know what they are buying. And for myself, the first exercise to do in a bank is mainly to understand what is the project of someone. And you speak about money, but money is only one way to put people who have savings with people who don't have savings by giving credit. But you need to understand that the credit is the people that can't really reimburse because you will have what we have in the States. And it's the same for people who have money, savings, and who have enterprise, who have product to have investment, and they don't have money. That's the stock exchange. And I'm really surprised that I have not heard this today, because for myself, what I do today, because I'm in asset management, is doing this. And that for myself, I'm really surprised by this.
Any comments from our panelists?
It's true, I did a fault. When I talked about products, I should have said products and services. It's a little bit the same. But I said also, the risk is to sell products to people they do not need, or more products than they need, or products without a social utility.
I completely agree with what you say. A bank is a service firm. You deliver service to people, And so this service relation is a central relation. Now, to come back to the financial crisis and so on, one of the problems that happened is that people could not give an honest service any longer because of the payment structure that some of these products were involved with. That, I think, is scandalous. So if you talk about ethical banking, you should also talk about ethical organizations. It's something that I did not develop here, I did it in other places, but there was a clear problem in the way that these incentive structures were formed inside these organizations. And then you push people to give wrong services. And then you destroy the whole system. So yes, it is also a parallel story about what is in an organization that has integrity. That is really part of it, and that's really a problem for any bank, also for new banks that we build.
Liv, in front. Was there someone before? Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for your question. Actually, one of my questions was, so the conference is entitled
The future.
No. no, social banking works?
Ethical banking
Ethical
works.
banking works. I would like to know how many bankers or traditional bankers actually there's in this room, because I don't have the impression there are so many. Okay, cool. I find that amazing that such a topic don't bring more bankers out there. I'm working for a platform that is raising funds for social companies with really high impact, which is called Lita.co. And we have the same views that you're sharing here tonight. Quite difficult to work in this institutional framework, and in the same time a momentum, but also the necessity to convince a lot of people that are not convinced yet by this systemic change that we need to build. And I was wondering how associations like yours, organizations like yours are working together in order to foster this momentum and to carry it way further than in this group of convinced people than we are here today, for example.
Thank you. Maybe we can hear Liv's question before we have comments on this. The microphone's coming, it's behind. Ah, voilà.
Thank you. It was more a reaction to what you said, Professor van Liedekerke, is I agree, I work for a Triodos Bank, so I'm aware of some of these discussions going on and following them from close. And it's true, there are changes going on, but at the same time, and that is what I want to bring in, let us not be let us not underestimate the flexibility of the existing system, because what is happening as well is that, of course, the traditional banks see what is happening, see that sustainability has a higher quote now. So what have traditional systems shown a lot of times in the past is that when revolution is starting in the margin, what do is you take how is that called, that medicine, you take a light portion, a homeopathic portion, so you can use the vocabulary, so you can use the whole context that you can refer to, but in the internal, the real system, you don't change. So let's not be blind for that type of, you have names for that, but at the same, it's not only, there is a variety, so there is change. You cannot, everything that is going on, you cannot simply say it's greenwashing. No, there is more going on, but let us not stop at the homeopathic portion, and that's the danger, because so many people, instances, are happy with what is going on, but it's still the homeopathic portion.
On the depth of ethics?
Yes, I think Liv is right. It's not because Carrefour sells 20% organic food, maybe 25, that Carrefour is a sustainable and ethical company. It's not because KBC, BNP Paribas Fortis, are getting better, that they are, but I only tell my views, that they are sustainable and ethical bank. If you are looking for a sustainable and ethical bank, it's something else. You have to look at governance, and you have to have that everything is right, not just 20%.
Capitalism assimilates everything as soon as it's attractive, sexy, and brings another return on investment. So there was a very a strong renaming and rebranding in Spain, that all the major banks that had failed renamed in now common good banks and ethical banks, and I'm the most sustainable one, I'm most responsible one. And even the German bank is talking about cultural change, and that's less than homeopathic, the truth part in it. On the other hand, the question was to the ethical banks. Looking at history, maybe those who are the best known banks are capitalistic banks, but the majority of all banks always have been ethical and not-for-profit banks. The credit unions, the cooperative banks, and the savings banks. In Germany, the savings banks, by law, are obliged to serve the common good. So these banks always have proven that. And the guy, the Raiffeisen, who I quoted, he was the founder of the Raiffeisen movement. Now it happened that in Austria, Raiffeisen is the most powerful network in Austria. And the central bank is a purely capitalistic institution. But the regional cooperative Raiffeisen banks still remember their roots and their original values. And concluding with Larry Fink from BlackRock, because I read his letter and I wanted to know, what did he really say? And he really said that every company should have a social purpose and should benefit society. So this, you could consider a revolution comparing with the business of business is business from Milton Friedman. But then reading the whole letter, of course, he gives the condition: as long as you pay a sustainable and meaningful financial return on investment to us and our clients, yeah. And then you can ask, is this a cultural change? Or is this just the attempt to combine what sounds good and what is business as usual? And that's why it's so important that we have legal definitions. And that's why I stressed so much the Italian law. They defined what is an ethical bank. And then no bank can say, I'm an ethical bank. No, 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 because we apply the legal criteria and you're off, all of you are off. And just the most serious ones, like Triodos, maybe like the GLS bank in Germany, like you and us, only very few will fulfill all criteria. And then we are back to the argument from before. We need role models, and then we need regulations and laws.
And I think, if I may, I think you just alluded to, or maybe indirectly, to public banking. So we made a conscious decision not to mix the discussion between ethical banks as in private banks owned by citizens who do what these citizens and cooperators want to do, and mix it with public banking. But I do think in a financial system that serves society, the role of public banks is absolutely key. Because if democracy functions, then you define a project for society. You could do it for Belgium, and a no-brainer should be we need a zero carbon economy. You need to define that economic project. So how do you get to a zero carbon economy sector by sector? And then you put public banks just to serve that with, not indirectly and so on, but because that is their mandate. Now you'll tell me it depends who's in government. Of course, that's democracy. So you might not like the government and then what the public bank does, but it is democracy. I would argue that in the pure private bank sector, in most cases, you don't get a better deal than you would with, so I think public banking, maybe to feed the discussions at the networking part in a few minutes, is also a key part of a healthy banking system.
Thank you. Do we have time for 2 last questions? I saw one in the middle here.
Yes.
And someone in front, and there's a third one. And I'm sorry, we'll have to conclude.
My question is quite short. I understood the warning from Professor van Liedekerke that organizations might be need to become small as well when banks are becoming small. But then my intuition would say it might be a good thing, because small enterprises tend to be natural persons, not something legal persons. So what are the real dangers when organizations would become smaller?
We need a discussion on what is the optimal size of an economic system. So that would take us very far. But in general, economists believe that if you would reduce the way we interact with goods and so on and services, that would lead to very large loss of welfare in general in the world. This is the reason why we are against Trump, who wants to start trade wars and so on and so forth. Because if you have this type of system, you reduce your economic system. And so the general idea is that you can work locally, but you would have to be satisfied with a much lower welfare level. I'm not saying that is impossible. It's probably very well possible. I cannot imagine the people in the 1960s here in Belgium that they were all unhappy. We are about 3 times more rich than they were, but they were not unhappy. So it is possible to live, but be aware that this is the choice you have to make. And if you want to make that choice, well, be aware that you will not be able to do city trips every 2 weeks. Forget it. Yeah. So these things will be gone.
So it's a positive change.
It's a positive change, absolutely. In that respect, it's definitely a positive change. Yeah.
City trips, okay.
The question in front.
Well, I used to work in banking, and actually my favorite game was the Russian roulette. And the Russian roulette is when you are about to shoot your head, but I knew that I was shooting with plastic balls, plastic bullets. And of course, I fear that the next crisis is again going to come with excessive risk-taking by the banks. And when you shoot with a plastic bullet, you don't have the risk. I think that to switch from ethics, from greed to ethics, you have to make greed life-threatening. And so if you have real bullets, in other words, if you separate banks, investment banks from deposit banks, it's life-threatening and bonus-threatening, and then you can stop the speculation and save society.
I think so. Robert is a member of Finance Watch. I think you just advocated, we remember this, that bankers play Russian roulette with real bullets. I think that's your recommendation. It's pretty strong.
There was a last question in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think the world is now facing 2 big problems, amongst others. The first one is the environmental crisis. So our economies is still relying on fossil fuels. And the second one, and we never hear about these topics in the discussion of today, is the social problem. Social inequalities have never been so high as in 2018. People have a lot of money, a lot of capital, a lot of things. Other people have nothing. And I think if a bank or if another enterprise wants really to be ethical, they have to play on these 2 levels. They have to play on the environmental level, but they also have to play on the social issue. And when we hear about ethical banking, we often hear about green banking. We invest into green funds. We invest into socially responsible investment. But we never hear about like the social issue. Decisions of mainstream banks are still taken by white men at the top. These white men have super high salaries, creating inegalities. Shareholders who invest into the bank will get super high dividends, creating inequalities. So what can we do within mainstream banks to change this? Not only playing onto the green thing, like investing into good green economies, but also play on this other core issue, which is diminishing, crucially, the distance between the rich and the poor.
Anyone on these governance issues?
Yeah, definitely you have to take the social issues on board, but do not think that this does not happen. So one of the things that I developed within ATBL is methodology, and how do you measure a sustainable company from non-sustainable? We have several components. We look at human rights, we look at social issues, we look at inequality issues, we look at environmental issues, we look at 6 domains. We have 150 indicators. We are not alone. The Sustainalytics and the visuals of this world, they all have developed this type of methodology. So do not think that this does not happen. Of course, people have preferences. Some people look more at environment, some look more at the social issues, so there can be differences. But in general, the market, if it's well done, they look at all sides. They really look at all sides now.
Maybe we will conclude here. If everybody wants to be a bit in Twitter mode and have a 30-second conclusion, who wants to start between our panelists? Okay.
Yes, I want to finish on Matthias' question. I think it goes very far, because what Matthias is talking about is a transformation, a change of society. And it's a question we have to choose. Do you want a bank which changes, transform society? It would be nice.
Yeah, so I think you said climate and inequality, and that these indicators are extremely clear that we're in a very dangerous zone right now. I think if you look at these indicators over the last 30 years, so globalization, I think there's been a massive increase. So when you say be careful what you lose, I think it's also about what you gain. Huh? I think so. But to finish on a more provocative note, I think if we undo financialization, because I think it was mainly a globalization of finance, or at least finance driven. I think then we stop. Of course, I'm extremely supportive of, as I said, right. But I think we should stop relying on banks and the financial system to change society. So the best immediate way to avoid climate change is a very strong carbon tax, a global carbon tax. But you can start it in any country. I mean, first of all, this will immediately move trillions of money from the private banking sector, because all of a sudden the projects that are brown will become economically unviable. So it will transform the whole economy. So that's economic regulation, not financial regulation. It's much more powerful. So we need a carbon tax, and that's the same thing with inequality. I mean, I think it's schizophrenic to ask the financial sector to reduce inequality. It is about tax, and corporate tax have gone like this for the last 30 years, and the marginal tax rate, so the tax rate on the highest incomes, and of course on capital, have gone like this as well. To undo this, it's very simple. You just need to put them in the other direction. It has nothing to do with finance.
1 10 seconds and 1 20 seconds. The 10 seconds, yes, of course, dialogue with and talk to murderers and sexual harassers and speed riders and free riders, and at the same time make regulations that they can't proceed as they did. And the 20 seconds, now I understood that it's about efficiency, the scale debate. And I think it's a brilliant example for the difference between economics and chrematistics, because what economists or chrematists, disguised as economists, deem as efficient is highly inefficient in building trust, in building cohesive societies, in building equality, in strengthening democracy, in stabilizing the global climate, in conserving cultural diversity, and maintaining everything that makes human lives valuable. Whereas true economists would pose the question differently and ask how efficiently can we use economic resources, amongst them capital, investments, allocation of capital, in order to increase trust, in order to increase cohesion, in order to stabilize the climate, in order to improve the environment, to strengthen democracy, to become more conscious about human dignity and gender relations, just for instance. That's also efficient, but maybe not in the classical grammatistic terms, but in the new economic terms.
Well, very briefly, I'm an economist, I'm a philosopher also, so I know about Aristotle, who was, by the way, not a Democrat, but I agree with the difference between economia and oikos nomos and the grammastica, so that's indeed a problem that we are faced with. Now the thing is, it's part of a transition, transition towards a sustainable economy. That's what we need to do. Do not think that economists are all the Fama and the Friedman guys. Also Schiller was given a Nobel Prize, so, and he has a completely different view of financial markets. So there's difference out there. And so when it comes to the central questions here, I would only repeat what I said before. Of course, Lieve is right that she points out, look, they will integrate it and it can be very shallow. And it is very shallow with some banks, what they do with some of the large banks. They say they change, but do they really change? Well, you need the alternatives. You need indeed the role models of ethical banks, and you need to push. Also as a customer, you have to ask the question. You know, if I have this money and I invest it somewhere, so you say this product, that's good for you, but what does it do? What does it do? Yeah? Is it a bicycle with brakes or without brakes? Yeah, you want to know. If you don't ask the question, who will ask the question? I mean, the pressure has to come from both sides, but you cannot neglect the existing system in the sense that you can say, well, we'll build it from underneath. It will take far too long. If you do not change the existing system along with that, we will be too late, to put it as simple as that.
Thank you. So what I've really marked me tonight are the different speakers, the different questions, the energy in the room. For me, what the professor said about raising ethic issues at university, I think this is really something that needs to be worked on. It would be great that we have a new generation of students that have different ways of thinking. What Benoit said, regulation, yes, but led by citizens, NGOs, members, I also think this is true. I think there is momentum. I think it's now that we have to act. What Tom said about values, very important. It's the DNA of bankings, ethical bankings, and it's that way that we have safeguards, that there's no mission drift. And what Christian said, among other things, is all about this new paradigm. How can we reach this new paradigm? Everybody working on it. And I hope that we go in. I'm a positive person, maybe an idealist, but I also think that we can go for it now, that the momentum is now. Thank you. So now you are all invited upstairs in this beautiful